With Top Gun Maverick officially the biggest hit of Tom Cruise's career, the superstar is once again at the top of the Hollywood heap, being celebrated as perhaps the greatest movie star of all time. And really, he is probably the greatest movie star of all time. I mean, look at his filmography. Not a lot of flops there, are there? I mean, you get the occasional Lions for Lambs and maybe A Night and Day here and there, but pretty much all of Tom Cruise's movies have grossed $100 million domestically and way more than that overseas. I mean, Tom Cruise is just a great, great star. But where did it begin for Tom Cruise? We're going to dig into his early days and the movie that really did make him a star in this episode of Tom Cruise Revisited, examining Risky Business. Cut back to the year 1981 when a young Tom Cruise, aka Thomas Cruise Mapother, made his feature debut in a small role in the Brooke Shields weepy Endless Love. Yes, you'd no doubt remember the song. It was a tiny part, but later that year he would have a major role in the film Taps. In it, a bunch of military recruits take over their military school in an armed insurrection when they learn it's about to be shut down by the government and taken away from their CO, played by George C. Scott. Of the students, there were 3 lead roles. The first, the movie's hero, was to be played by Timothy Hutton, who had just won an Oscar for Ordinary People. The second, the hero's best friend and confidant, was played by Sean Penn, who himself would become a star the next year with Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
You dick!
The third lead, and perhaps the most interesting, went to Cruise, with him playing the film's antagonist, a recruit who goes insane and instigates the movie's tragic climax. It was an edgy part, and it put him on the map in a big way. In 1983, he would join the cast of Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders, although to his disappointment, he did not get one of the leads. His role, in fact, would be cut down in post-production. No matter, the world had bigger plans for Tom Cruise in 1983, and no, it was not the teen sex comedy Losing It. That movie would open and close in April of '83 and perhaps rank as Cruise's most obscure movie ever. No, 1983 would be the year Tom Cruise would strip down to his boxers, shimmy around a house lip-syncing Bob Seger, and becoming a legit movie star in Risky Business. The film, which is far more sophisticated and artistic than people remember, is the brainchild of writer-director Paul Brickman. Brickman is a pretty interesting figure. While Risky Business was a hit, the fact that he had to compromise on the ending left him disillusioned as a filmmaker, and he only ever directed one more film, the Jessica Lange drama Men Don't Leave in 1990. Brickman's creative conflicts with the film's backer, the legendary record exec David Geffen, who was moving into movies through his deal with Warner Brothers, would become legendary, but more on those later. Thanks for watching Tom Cruise Revisited. If you like what you see, make sure to click on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. Now, back to the show. At first, Brickman himself wasn't sure about Tom Cruise starring as Joel, the suburban teenager who, when left alone for a week, gets involved with a high-class escort, ruins his dad's Porsche, and gets a major lesson in capitalism when he becomes an unlikely pimp for his suburban friends. Cruise auditioned for the movie while on a break from The Outsiders. Now, in that film, he was playing a greaser, so he had a cap on his chipped tooth removed and had long, greasy, unkempt hair, a far cry from the conservative Joel, who's like the prototypical 80s yuppie kid. I mean, he's kind of like an Alex P. Keaton type. Yet, Brickman eventually saw him together with Rebecca De Mornay, who would play the love interest Lana, and was struck by how good the two looked together and went with him, a move that, I have to say, kind of paid off in the end. Risky Business is quite unusual for a teen sex comedy. It's directed like an art film. Brickman was more influenced by European cinema than the current trendy teen comedy genre, and if you watch this next to another big hit of the era, Porky's, it seems like they come from different planets. They're just very, very different. Risky Business is sleek and classy, despite the occasionally crude subject matter. To me, the most intriguing part of the movie is Cruise's performance as Joel. I don't think people would have liked the character had it been played by anyone else. On the page, Joel seems like the kind of guy who a few years down the line would be doing bumps of cocaine with Patrick Bateman in the bathroom at Dorsia. The way Cruise plays him, you believe that after graduating, Joel maybe enlisted in the Navy and changed his name to Maverick. I mean, he seems like a guy you want to watch. Nowadays, a lot about Risky Business may seem slightly un-PC, but there's a maturity here that's really allowed it to stand the test of time. Even a scene where Joel encounters a trans sex worker is played with some degree of sensitivity, at least for 1983. One thing worth noting about Risky Business is how sexy it is. Most teen comedies are funny, but not really hot. Risky Business is one sexy movie with the sex part played straight-faced. When Joel hooks up with DeMornay's Lana, Brickman wants the audience to be turned on, not to laugh. While Cruz became a star off of this, Rebecca De Mornay also became a major sex symbol for the 80s and 90s, and off-screen, her and Cruz would briefly become an item before she returned to her one true love, Harry Dean Stanton. Good for you, Harry. She's a few years older than Cruz, and the age difference works in the movie's favor, as Lana is a lot more worldly and taking Joel for a bit of a ride. The issues Brickman had with Geffen relate mostly to the ending. As it ends now, Joel is a bit of a stud, and he jokes with Lana that he'd still be open to seeing her for the right price. Basically, he's no longer the naive suburban boy, but a man with the charisma and experience to keep a woman like Lana. The original ending is more bittersweet and, dare I say, realistic. Joel is off to Princeton while Lana is returning to the streets and to her life as a prostitute. The two will likely never see each other again, and he'll forget her in time. Both of them know it. It's really a downer, but it's also kind of the truth and one of the few moments where Lana really lets her guard down. But alas, it's not the heroic Tom Cruise ending the audience wanted, and Geffen knew it. So Brickman had to make the change, and seemingly never got over it. Whatever the case, Risky Business was a smash hit in the fall of 1983. It only cost $6 million and change, but it made over 10 times that domestically. Looking back at it now, Cruise, despite being so young, emerges as a fully realized version of the movie star we know and love. It's the first movie where he flashes that multi-million-dollar grin and rocks a pair of Ray-Bans, which indeed led to sales spiking something like 2,000%. It's also got a classic soundtrack by Tangerine Dream with the track Love on a Real Train, one of the most instantly identifiable music cues of the 80s. Tangerine Dream would score tons of movies after this and a lot of teen movies, such as 3 O'Clock High, which is another really good flick. Besides Bob Seger's old-time rock and roll, it also featured Phil Collins's In the Air Tonight a full year before Miami Vice would make it iconic. The scene where they make love on a real train was actually kind of paid homage to in this great TV show called The Americans, with them playing, of course, In the Air Tonight. It also features early roles for a lot of beloved 80s character actors, such as Curtis Armstrong, who plays Joel's best pal and would famously play Booger in the next year's Revenge of the Nerds. Bronson Pinchot, who plays another one of Joel's pals, would go on to fame starring as Belky Bartakamus in Perfect Strangers, while Joey Pants, aka Joe Pantoliano, has an early but pretty meaty role as Lana's pimp Guido.
I've got a trig midterm tomorrow and I'm being chased by Guido, the killer pimp.
So, if you haven't seen Risky Business in a while, it's definitely worth a revisit with fresh eyes. It's a lot more sophisticated and sexy than you may remember, and it ranks among one of Cruise's most important screen roles ever, considering what it did for his career. While Top Gun made him an icon, without Risky Business, he would have never gotten Top Gun, so the Cruise legend begins with this 1983 classic. 1983 was a big year for Tom Cruise, as he had not one, not two, not three, but 4 movies in theaters by the time the year was out. One of them, Losing It, would sink without a trace. Another, The Outsiders, would see his role virtually removed in the cutting room. The third, Risky Business, would make him a superstar. And the fourth, All the Right Moves, would become a perennially underrated favorite among fans, such as myself. So, let's dive right in and discuss why All the Right Moves has all the right Cruise. In August of 1983, Risky Business became an unexpected smash hit, grossing $63 million domestically. Pretty big deal for 1983. It would become the 10th highest grossing movie of the year. 20th Century Fox must have been thrilled, as they didn't produce Risky Business, but they had another already wrapped Tom Cruise movie in the can, All the Right Moves. A modestly budgeted drama directed by the famed cinematographer Michael Chapman, who shot Raging Bull and much of Martin Scorsese's early work, the film told the story of a high school football player named Stefan, played by Tom Cruise, whose only shot at escaping his blue-collar town, which is lorded over by the specter of a coal mine his father and brother both work at, is through an athletic scholarship to college. Luckily, he has, as the title says, all the right moves. Way too short to be a professional player, with the movie generously giving his height at 5'10", although he's probably more like 5'7" on a good day. He wants to get himself educated and dreams of becoming an electrical engineer. He's determined not to fall into the trap many of his friends have fallen into, in that once they graduate high school, they settle down with their girlfriends, get married, and have babies. In the movie, this happens to the character played by Chris Penn, who's his best friend in the film. He gets his girlfriend pregnant and has to turn down a scholarship to school in order to stay behind and marry her. Cruise's character, Stefan, is single-minded in his determination to succeed, but this puts him at odds with his coach, played by Craig T. Nelson, whose own history is strikingly similar to Stefan's. The two butt heads, and a prank gone awry leads to the coach blackballing Stefan, ending any hope he has of an athletic scholarship in one fell swoop, dooming him to a life in the coal mines. Now, All the Right Moves is a terrific movie not enough people have seen. For one thing, it's extremely evocative of its time. The early 80s were brutal for small towns such as the one depicted in All the Right Moves. These towns all sprung up around the various industries, in this case coal, and for the parents of the kids in a movie such as this, they were able to lead pretty good lives with good wages and were able to support their families. But this is the start of the recession, where plants were shutting down and people lost their jobs and livelihoods overnight. Towns such as the one in this movie were decimated, with many of them now a shell of their former selves. The town this was shot in, Johnstown, is currently the poorest town in Pennsylvania, with 38% of the population living under the poverty line. The town has also been ravaged by the opioid epidemic. How did we get here? Watch All the Right Moves. In a lot of ways, All the Right Moves is a pretty brutal indictment of the way small towns were left to rot in the 80s, but is dressed up as a teen movie. Cruise is terrific as Stefan, with his mounting desperation and need to escape brilliantly conveyed. Perhaps the best part of the movie revolves around his romance with his girlfriend Lisa, played by Leah Thompson. There's a lot going on in the relationship. Stefan is desperate to have sex with her, but she holds out. She doesn't want to tie him to her small town, or herself for that matter. She realizes something heartbreaking, that the opportunity that he's getting to escape via an athletic scholarship is something she could never dream of doing. Like pretty much everyone else, she's going to be stuck here after they graduate while he goes off to college. She doesn't resent him for this. Rather, her heart breaks for him when she sees that he's going to be trapped, just like his friends. There's an amazing scene where she has a heart-to-heart with the coach's wife, played by Sandy Faison, where she begs her to use her influence to get Nelson to drop his grudge. They acknowledge how similar they are, as they were both smart girls in high school who fell in love with these golden boys who eventually left town for greatness, leaving them behind. The coach's wife knows what the stakes are for Stefan, and she's also desperate for her husband to end his vendetta, which is going to come to nothing. All it's going to do is destroy this young man's life, and she knows it. Yet, while Craig T. Nelson could have been playing the film's villain, he's made entirely sympathetic. The movie introduces him grooving in private to a pop song the boys are dancing to in the showers. He's a funny, nice guy, but circumstances put him at odds with Stefan to the point that he thinks the headstrong player has vandalized his home and endangered his family. This makes him feel powerless, and he's blinded by a need to get even. But he also won't open his eyes to the fact that appearances can be deceiving and that Stefan is not who he thinks he is. All of this was probably lost on the teen audience that made All the Right Moves a modest but hardly overwhelming success at the box office. It grossed $17.2 million, which was about 3 times its budget. Not bad. In the years since, though, this movie is known mostly as the film where Tom Cruise and Leah Thompson get naked. But there's way more to it than that, and notably on that nude scene, Cruise himself wasn't supposed to get naked during the love scene, but he didn't think it was fair for Leah Thompson to be singled out, so they both wound up doing the scene nude, and it became a scene that was often rewound over and over and over again on VHS copies of the film. While a modest movie, All the Right Moves has an interesting, gritty look as you'd expect given that Michael Chapman directed and Jan de Bont was the cinematographer. Funny story, one of the producers of this movie was none other than Lucille Ball of I Love Lucy, although this sexy R-rated drama is probably pretty far removed from what she was known for. The lady was pretty with it seems, and down with the times. My only issue with the movie is that the soundtrack could be better. They were clearly trying to sell albums with it, but outside of the title song, which is pretty decent, none of the tracks they're pushing hard made much of a dent on the charts. The end credits actually promotes the soundtrack over the cast, which is very strange considering that this is an actor-driven drama. But then again, Flashdance had just came out, and the soundtrack made as much money as the movie. In the end, All the Right Moves' biggest legacy is that it probably landed Craig T. Nelson the sitcom that made him a star, Coach, with him playing a character that's strikingly similar to the one he plays here. It's ripe for rediscovery, and one of Tom Cruise's most underrated movies. Tom Cruise had one heck of a year in 1983. He had 4 movies come out, including the teen sex romp Losing It, the Francis Ford Coppola epic The Outsiders, Risky Business, and All the Right Moves. The latter two films helped make him a major star, and all eyes were on his follow-up vehicle, which turned out to be the one and only time Tom Cruise would work with legendary director Ridley Scott on the fantasy epic Legend. Now, it has to be said, Legend was a very troubled production and is now mostly seen as a footnote in Tom Cruise's career, one that he rarely talks about, although the film does indeed have a devoted cult following, including JoBlo's own Jessica Dwyer, who once dedicated a great episode of her show fantasizing about fantasy films to it. One of the most confusing things about the film is discerning between the various cuts, with the film undergoing a pretty belabored post-production process, but more on that later. Legend tells the tale of a princess, played by Mia Sara, who's in love with a forest-dwelling rogue named Jack, played by our boy Tom Cruise, sporting some legendary hair. An evil force named Darkness, played by the one and only Tim Curry, in some of the best makeup of the 80s, wants to cast the world into eternal night by killing all unicorns. Too bad then that Jack, wanting to impress the princess, brings her to where all the unicorns are, and she can't help but bait them, allowing the bad guys to take one of the unicorn's horns. Wanting to set things right, she allows herself to be taken by the forces of darkness, and what's Jack gonna do but rescue his kinda beloved, although the relationship seems in a weird gray zone between friends and lovers. I don't know. He's helped in the rescue by some odd forest friends, including the very strangely dubbed Gump, played by David Bennett of the art house hit The Tin Drum. Look it up. At the time the movie was made, Ridley Scott was coming off of two back-to-back masterpieces, Alien and Blade Runner, but it's important to remember that the latter film was definitely not a hit when it was first released, leaving him in a vulnerable position when the American studio bankrolling the film, Universal, saw the final cut. His take on fairy tales and the Brothers Grimm, Legend was in a strange position in that it was too gothic and grim for kids, but perhaps too fanciful for adults. Nevertheless, Scott attempted to make a startlingly original film, and it's striking how different it is from other fantasy movies of the era, which mostly adopted the Conan the Barbarian model of blood and boobs. Now, nothing against blood and boobs, but that's not exactly what Ridley Scott is going for here, now is it? Legend is more mystical and anticipates the way the genre would go once Peter Jackson's version of Lord of the Rings was released, but part of the reason that movie had such a long transition to the big screen was that this movie was such a giant flop that studios were terrified of making fantasy films for years after Legend came out. That's why it took 15 years. It also seemed to scare Ridley Scott off the genre for good, and who could blame him? Logistically, the film was a nightmare, with every cast member but Tom Cruise and Mia Sara needing extensive makeup, especially Curry. This was an era before CGI, where everything had to be done practically, but Ridley Scott lucked out as far as his cast went, especially with Curry, whose presence and voice is perhaps the greatest special effect anyone could ever hope for. A young Mia Sara, who would go on to star in Ferris Bueller's Day Off the next year, is perfectly cast as the arrogant but ultimately good princess. Her and Cruise certainly look the romantic pair, but here's the thing. Tom Cruise is not great in this movie. He's always been hit and miss in period fare and arguably wouldn't nail the genre until The Last Samurai in 2003. But there's a reason he's never really gone all in on fantasy films, and I would never expect him to show up in something like The Hobbit. Legend is pretty much it as far as Tom Cruise's forays into the fantasy genre go. It's not that he's bad per se, he just seems, I don't know, silly. Rumor has it that Robert Downey Jr., Jim Carrey, and Johnny Depp were all up for the role, and looking at their work in that era, I think that Johnny Depp probably would have nailed it. He has more of a flair for roles like this. Tom Cruise just feels too contemporary, like, something off of an MTV music video, especially in the 80s. But, this would turn out to be a misstep for Cruise, and a valuable one that would definitely inform his career going forward. What's sad is that him and Ridley Scott never worked together again, which seems bizarre all things considered, considering they must have been in each other's orbit quite a bit. Perhaps there's some bad blood there, although it definitely didn't stop Cruise from later working with Ridley Scott's brother Tony to iconic effect, and Ridley has been effusive in his praise of Top Gun Maverick. Perhaps the two will reunite someday. But back to how tortured a production this is. Anyone who watches Legend will no doubt be blown away by the production design, with the magical forest set being built on the 007 stage at Pinewood Studios. The production was faced with disaster 10 days before the film wrapped when the stage burnt to the ground. Luckily, no one was hurt and the film was able to wrap, but it was a bad omen. Indeed, when he turned in the final cut to Universal, Scott was faced with a conundrum. The studio wanted to market the movie to teens and made him cut it down from 2 hours to just over 90. In the unkindest cut of all, though, Jerry Goldsmith's masterful score, which took him 6 months to compose, was scrapped and replaced by a weird electronic score by Tangerine Dream. Now, I love Tangerine Dream, especially the work on Sorcerer and The Keep, but 1986 Tangerine Dream was not 1977 or 1983's Tangerine Dream. They had done a lot of movies by this point, and I don't know, it seemed like they were kind of falling into some kind of schlocky territory. And this is definitely not one of their better scores. Although the song at the end of the movie, Is Your Love Strong Enough by Brian Ferry of Roxy Music, kind of kicks ass. Scott was allowed to release the international cut with Goldsmith's score because 20th Century Fox put it out and, I guess they didn't want that silly Tangerine Dream score. Good for them. But this did lead to some confusion over the years. Kids from the UK grew up listening to Goldsmith's score while kids in the US listened to Tangerine Dreams. As is pretty common for Scott, years later he made the director's cut of Legend, which reinstates the score and runs about 20 minutes longer than the original cut, leading to a major critical reevaluation of the film, because just like his director's cuts for Blade Runner, Kingdom of Heaven, and pretty much any other movie he released the director's cut for, it's better. To me, Legend is an interesting film with some brilliant moments, especially the production design and cinematography, but oddly, the thing that keeps it from being great is the miscast Tom Cruise. Nevertheless, it's an interesting curio. Sometimes fiascos and flops are as important to a career as the hits, and indeed Legend only grossed about $23 million in the US. Had it come out earlier, it might have had more of an impact on Cruise's career, but the US release was so delayed that within a month of it opening, Top Gun was already in theaters, and we all know how that went. It would definitely adversely affect Ridley Scott's career for some time though, with his next movie, the noir thriller Someone to Watch Over Me, being an even bigger flop, although it's kind of an interesting little movie if you go and check it out. His stylish Michael Douglas movie, Black Rain, would restore his clout somewhat, and his next film after that, Thelma and Louise, would be another hit, but the rest of the 90s were peppered with financial disasters for Scott, including 1492, Conquest of Paradise, White Squall, and G.I. Jane, although in their own way, all three of those movies are actually pretty good. Everything would change for him after the release of Gladiator in 2000, when suddenly, in his 60s, Ridley Scott would become one of the most bankable directors in the world. And you know what? He's still making great films today, with The Last Duel being criminally underrated. Yeah. Just like my good buddy Tom Cruise, Ridley Scott's a guy you can never count out. And you know what? I hope these two work together again someday soon, because a Tom Cruise movie directed by Ridley Scott, always worth checking out, even if Legend didn't quite work. In 1983, Tom Cruise became a legitimate star upon the release of the slick, stylish sex comedy Risky Business, but it would take another much bigger film to make him the phenomenon that we know and love to this day, and that movie would be 1986's Tony Scott classic Top Gun. Produced by hitmakers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, it married the MTV aesthetic of their previous hit Flashdance with high-flying action, and with Tom Cruise they had an actor that was on the verge of superstardom that would be unrivaled, with many believing that he's perhaps the greatest movie star of all time. But how did it all happen? That's what we're going to tell you all about in Top Gun Revisited. Flashback to the year 1983. Now this was a very important year for most of the principals involved with Top Gun. Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer had a major hit at Paramount with Flashdance, with it being the first movie to wholly embrace the then trendy music video style that was driving kids in the US crazy. They just couldn't get enough of it on MTV, so it only figured that it would carry over to film. Flashdance had probably a thin storyline, with it being about a beautiful welder who moonlights as a dancer, but it had oodles of style and a red-hot soundtrack, in addition to a gorgeous leading lady in Jennifer Beals. Now, with this, they had the three elements that they would use over and over and over again, Simpson and Bruckheimer. These three elements were the music, the style, and the sex appeal of the lead. It was a formula that would serve them very well in Top Gun. Meanwhile, director Tony Scott also had a movie out in 1983, The Hunger, starring Catherine Deneuve, Susan Sarandon, and David Bowie. It was a giant flop, but Simpson and Bruckheimer must have seen it and noted the stylishness, because whatever faults it may have, it is one cool looking movie, and it would adapt perfectly to their winning formula. At the same time, the two future leads of Top Gun each had their breakout roles, with Cruise being propelled to movie star status with Risky Business, while Kelly McGillis got noticed in the successful sleeper hit Reuben Reuben. The next few years would be pivotal ones for all involved. Simpson and Bruckheimer tried the Flashdance aesthetic in two films. One, 1984's Thief of Hearts, was a flop, but the other, Beverly Hills Cop, was a box office mega hit. In the meantime, Kelly McGillis also had a hit when she starred opposite Harrison Ford in 1985's Witness, although Tom Cruise's career hadn't yet made it to the next level. He had two movies come out after Risky Business. One was 1983's All the Right Moves, which was a decent-sized hit, but 1985's Legend, directed by Tony Scott's brother Ridley, was a giant flop. He needed a hit fast, but he would get one. Thank you for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our JoBlo Originals channel, tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support. The genesis of Top Gun has its roots in an article in California Magazine which profiled the hotshot pilots training at a naval base in Miramar, dubbed Fighter Town, USA. Simpson and Bruckheimer saw the potential of the premise and commissioned a screenplay by Jack Epps and Jim Cash. Tony Scott was hired to direct, not necessarily on the basis of The Hunger, but rather because of this commercial that he did for Saab. As you can see from that commercial, all the elements are there. When it came time to cast the lead, it was really a no-brainer for all involved. Lieutenant Pete Maverick Mitchell is a perfect movie star part. He's a rebel, but one with a strict code of honor and a heroic streak. For Simpson and Bruckheimer, the role was always meant for Tom Cruise, even if other actors such as Matthew Modine have said that they were offered the part. It was the first film of his career that Cruise would help build from the ground up, and it set the tone for the rest of his career. So many of the Tom Cruise trademarks show up here for the first time, including his signature close-cropped haircut and his patented mix of boyishness and rebelliousness that would make audiences fall in love with him worldwide. And this is also the first movie where Tom Cruise rides a motorcycle. For children of the 80s, Tom Cruise was the cool older brother that you just always wanted. He was the guy that showed up on his motorcycle with a lady on the back and seemed too cool for school. We all wanted to be Tom Cruise. What someone like James Dean was to the 50s, or even the Fonz to the 70s, Top Gun's Maverick was to the 80s and beyond. Even though it's a role he avoided making a sequel to for decades, it's the part that's still most closely identified with Cruise because Maverick is exactly the kind of guy we all think Tom Cruise is. They're kind of hard to separate. In Top Gun, Cruise is surrounded by a terrific cast of up-and-comers and veterans. Kelly McGillis is actually a few years older than Tom Cruise, and the fact that she's more mature on screen than him actually works in the movie's favor, as Maverick really is supposed to come off as boyish, and her gradual seduction by him gives the movie an edge, even if the two apparently didn't get along all that well on set. McGillis's brainy civilian instructor was closely patterned after a woman named Christine Fox, and if you see photos of her, that's Kelly McGillis to a T. She's got the hair, she's got the blouses, she really does look just like her. And like McGillis' character, she worked as a civilian instructor at Miramar. The cast would be filled out by a who's who of rising young actors, which included Anthony Edwards, who had just come off of a few teen hits, Revenge of the Nerds and Gotcha. In this, he would play Maverick's best friend in Rio, Goose, whose tragic fate made many men weep for the next 30 plus years. Also look out for early roles from Meg Ryan as Goose's wife, Tim Robbins, Michael Ironside, and that old 80s standby James Tolkien, whose bald head was a staple of pretty much every major 80s movie. But the major roles here would be filled out by Tom Skerritt and Val Kilmer. Skerritt would play Maverick's pseudo-father figure at Top Gun, Viper, who has his back when he's almost grounded permanently. But arguably, the other most important role in the film outside of Maverick would be Iceman. You see, Ice needed to feel like a leading man in his own right, and he needed an actor on par with Cruise, at least in terms of star power. We had to believe that Ice is a believable threat to Maverick's prowess, and the frosty relationship between Cruise and Kilmer off-screen adds tremendously to their chemistry. You believe that the two hate each other in some ways, but also have a grudging respect, and their relationship really is one of the richest in the film, and pays off handsomely in the sequel. Of course, many other elements would go into making Top Gun a hit, including the then amazing aerial footage, filtered cinematography, sound design, and more, but chief among these was the music. First, there's the score by Harold Faltermeyer, which begins with the iconic Top Gun anthem, which features guitarist Steve Stevens. Like his previous Axel F, it would have a life beyond the film and even won a Grammy and got a music video. It's so iconic that it's reused heavily in Top Gun Maverick. You simply can't have a Top Gun movie without the... In addition to the score, there's also the soundtrack of pop hits, which is pumped up with tracks by composer Giorgio Moroder. Many of these would become big hits, but two of them, Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone and Berlin's Take My Breath Away, would become immortal. Take My Breath Away would win the Academy Award for Best Original Song, while Danger Zone, like the Top Gun anthem, would become so closely identified with Tom Cruise and Maverick that the song would be reused in the sequel all these years later. One thing worth noting about Top Gun is how middling its critical reaction was. You see, some critics liked it despite themselves, but many despised it for its high concept and aesthetics. In that period, saying the words high concept was a bad thing. People didn't like that, but high concept, as we all know now, would come to dominate films in the 80s and 90s and would become a trademark of producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer. In fact, Don Simpson's biography, which is quite the risque read, is actually called High Concept. The critical divisiveness remains to this day, with noted critic and film historian Mark Harris maintaining, in what he admitted was a brash generalization, that it killed movies, and that it presented film as pure product, or as he puts it, rails of cinematic cocaine with only one goal, the transient heightening of sensation. Basically, Harris calls it a roller coaster ride, but Top Gun is not the first movie to be guilty of that. In fact, you could say that most classics, in some ways, are roller coaster rides. What is Jaws if not a roller coaster ride? Regardless of what critics thought, Top Gun was an absolute smash hit, with it a $15 million movie that made over $357 million worldwide. With numbers like that in 1986, it was more than a hit. You could call a movie a hit now, but it's in and out of theaters in a matter of weeks, but Top Gun just stayed around forever and ever and became such a huge part of the pop culture. It made Tom Cruise arguably the biggest star in the world overnight. It was just a landmark film. In fact, for years to come, there would be Top Gun clones flooding theaters.
I am the greatest. 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 Those coming up. Bake them, cook them, clean them, hose them, boil them. All gone. Bye-bye.
Heck, Tom Cruise, Tony Scott, Don Simpson, and Jerry Bruckheimer even tried to make one themselves, Days of Thunder, which was called by many Top Cars. Albeit, of course, it was set in the world of racing. Yet, if you go back and watch Top Gun now, you'll be struck by how character-driven it is, despite what critics might have said about it at the time, and that it was all flash. It really isn't. There's lots of action in it, but there's lots of emotion too, and the action really kind of propels the characterizations. Critics did not appreciate it back then and seem not to notice it now, at least most of them anyway. Much of the dialogue has revolved around the action or perceived homoeroticism.
This gives me a hard-on.
By the end of Vietnam, that ratio was back up to 12-1.
Don't tease me.
Which I suppose has to be intentional given that volleyball scene, but I think at its heart, Scott, Simpson, and Bruckheimer were trying to make a film that would appeal to everyone, and in that they succeeded. I mean, outside of stuffy film critics, who doesn't love Top Gun? It is one of the most universally beloved films of all time, and for good reason. It is just pure entertainment from beginning to end. Small trivia note, Top Gun also revolutionized home video. Back then, sell-through VHS tapes were priced for rental, meaning that they were over $100 a piece. This is something I don't think that people nowadays really appreciate. When we were young and we wanted to buy our favorite movies, unless we waited at least a year, it would cost about $100 to buy a VHS, and even then you had to go to a wholesaler. But Top Gun, like a couple of other movies, was available pretty much everywhere for a relatively reasonable price. Some blockbusters at the time, such as Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, went for about $40 a piece, but in 1987, Paramount priced this at only $26.95, which was mind-blowing back then, and turned this into a major stocking stuffer. If you had a VHS collection in the 80s, you had these titles. You had Top Gun, you had E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which actually, despite being older than Top Gun, came out something like 2 years after Top Gun on video, and then of course Batman. And this was the first of those movies to be sold direct to consumers. That's pretty cool, isn't it? In the end, Top Gun truly is an unassailable classic. In 1986, critics may have scoffed at the aesthetic, but now it almost seems low-key in comparison to what's out in theaters every week. I mean, it's a pretty tight, contained movie. It's about an hour and 50 minutes. It's paced really well, but it also has a lot of drama and some really good acting. It holds up as a film of its time, but also when you watch it now, it holds up all these years later. You couldn't really remake Top Gun because what's the point? It's pretty perfect as it is. And when you watch it, you see something incredible. The legit birth of a movie icon in Tom Cruise, who's still seemingly at the top of his game 36 years later. In fact, Top Gun Maverick is kind of the perfect Tom Cruise star vehicle, so that's one that anybody who appreciates Top Gun has to rush out and see in theaters because it really is the perfect follow-up. Top Gun is a classic. It was a huge hit in 1986, and it would be a massive hit if it was to come out now. And to me, and to a lot of us here at JoBlo.com, it's one of our favorite movies ever.